The spring of 1944 brought with it promises of freedom across occupied Europe. American forces pushed through French territory, liberating town after town from Nazi control. Staff Sergeant William Cooper marched alongside his unit toward a small commune in northern France. Freshly freed from German occupation just days prior, the soldiers expected what they had seen in propaganda reels: jubilant crowds, flowers thrown at their feet, champagne bottles opened in celebration. They prepared themselves for the embrace of grateful civilians, for songs and dancing in the streets. But the scene that awaited Cooper defied all expectation. The town square stood eerily silent. No flags waved from windows. No children ran toward the convoy. The buildings, though structurally intact, seemed to exhale decay. Cooper noticed the windows first, many covered with cloth or boards, others revealing only darkness within. The cobblestone streets, empty of celebration, bore witness to a different kind of devastation. Then he saw them. Figures emerged from doorways and alleys, moving with the slow deliberation of ghosts. These were not the vibrant French citizens he had imagined. These were living shadows, human forms stripped to their essential frames, men whose clothes hung like burial shrouds on skeletal bodies, women whose faces had become masks of hollowed cheeks and protruding bones. Their eyes, Cooper would never forget their eyes, held something worse than fear or anger. They held nothing at all, empty wells where hope had once lived. Cooper's stomach tightened. He had witnessed combat, seen men die in brutal ways. But this silent suffering carried its own unique horror. These people had survived the occupation, yet survival had extracted a terrible price. A woman approached, her movements uncertain, as if her legs might betray her at any moment. She clutched a bundle to her chest, not supplies or belongings, but a child. The girl could not have been more than 7 years old, though malnutrition made age impossible to determine with certainty. Her arms resembled thin branches, her stomach distended in cruel contrast to her stick-like limbs. The child's hair, brittle and colorless, framed a face that had aged beyond its years. The mother stopped several feet from Cooper, her lips forming words that took immense effort to produce. Her voice emerged as barely more than a whisper, hoarse from disuse or desperation. "S'il vous plaît, nourriture, pour ma fille." Cooper did not speak French fluently, but he understood food for her daughter. The universal language of hunger required no translation. The woman's eyes, though dimmed by prolonged suffering, still held a flicker of maternal desperation. She was begging not for herself, but for the frail child in her arms. Other civilians began to gather, drawn by the presence of the Americans like moths to flame. They maintained distance, uncertain whether to hope or to fear. Some leaned against walls for support. Others sat on the ground, too weak to stand for long. A few raised trembling hands in tentative greeting, but most simply stared with that same terrible emptiness Cooper had first noticed. This was liberation. Not the triumphant moment of freedom the newsreels had promised, but the grim revelation of what occupation had truly meant. The Nazis had taken more than territory and political control. They had stolen the fundamental sustenance of life itself, reducing an entire population to the edge of extinction. Cooper reached for his ration pack, hands moving with purpose for the first time since entering the town. Whatever he had expected to find here, this was not it. But one thing had become immediately, devastatingly clear. The war for these people was far from over. The devastation Cooper witnessed was not accidental. It was the calculated result of 4 years of systematic starvation orchestrated by the Nazi occupation forces. From 1940 onward, German authorities implemented policies designed to extract maximum resources from France, while leaving the civilian population with barely enough to survive. And often, not even that. The occupation regime requisitioned vast quantities of French agricultural production, shipping grain, livestock and dairy products back to Germany. What remained for French civilians fell catastrophically short of basic nutritional needs. Official rations in many regions dropped to less than 1,300 calories per day, half of what an adult required to maintain health. For children, the elderly, and pregnant women, these meager allocations meant slow death. Winter had proven especially merciless. The brutal cold of 1944, combined with fuel shortages, created conditions of unimaginable hardship. Families burned furniture, books, anything combustible to generate a few hours of warmth. In some households, people slept together in single rooms, sharing body heat to survive the frigid nights. Food became an obsession that consumed every waking thought. Mothers foraged in forests for roots and bark. They boiled leather to extract whatever nutrients it might contain. Cats and dogs disappeared from the streets, not lost but consumed. Pigeons vanished from town squares. Families planted window boxes with anything that might grow, desperate for a single potato or carrot. Black markets flourished, but only the wealthy could afford their inflated prices. A single egg cost what a working man might earn in a week, if he could find work at all. Butter became a luxury as distant as diamonds. Meat existed only in memory and dreams. The children suffered most acutely. Their growing bodies required nutrients that simply did not exist. Vitamin deficiencies caused diseases thought eradicated generations earlier. Rickets twisted young bones, scurvy rotted gums and loosened teeth. Tuberculosis spread through weakened populations like fire through dry grass. Infant mortality rates climbed steadily. Women stopped menstruating, their bodies too depleted to sustain reproductive functions. Psychological deterioration accompanied physical decline. The constant gnawing of hunger drove people to madness. Some lost the ability to think beyond their next meal. Others became listless, conserving every ounce of energy. Families fractured under the strain. Theft from neighbors became commonplace. Trust eroded along with body weight. Marie Dubois, a schoolteacher from Normandy, recorded in her diary, "I watch my children fade like photographs left in sunlight. Their laughter has disappeared. Their games have stopped. They ask me when we will eat, and I have no answer. I tell them tomorrow, always tomorrow. But tomorrow never comes with enough food. My daughter asked me yesterday if dying hurts. She is 8 years old." By the time Allied forces began liberating French territories, entire communities teetered on the brink of collapse. The systematic deprivation had transformed a nation of vibrant people into a population of living ghosts. Liberation would bring political freedom, but the physical and psychological scars of starvation would require far more than military victory to heal. This was the France that awaited American soldiers, not a grateful nation ready to celebrate, but a dying population desperate for the most basic element of survival: food. Cooper stood motionless, the weight of understanding settling over him like lead. The ration pack in his hand suddenly felt insignificant, a single meal against an ocean of need. Around him, his fellow soldiers experienced similar revelations. Men who had stormed beaches and fought through hedgerows now found themselves confronting an enemy they could not shoot, the aftermath of systematic human cruelty. The French mother with her skeletal daughter had not moved. She remained frozen in her posture of desperate supplication, waiting for Cooper's response. Her eyes tracked his movements with animal intensity. Behind her, more civilians emerged from their hiding places, forming a loose semicircle around the American soldiers. They maintained distance, as if afraid that approaching too quickly might shatter this fragile moment of potential salvation. Cooper knelt down, bringing himself to eye level with the child. Up close, her condition appeared even more catastrophic. Her skin stretched paper-thin over bone, so translucent he could trace the network of blue veins beneath. Her breathing came shallow and rapid. When he looked into her eyes, he saw something that would haunt him for decades: awareness. This child understood she was dying. She knew hunger not as temporary discomfort, but as a permanent companion slowly consuming her from within. He opened his ration pack with deliberate care, unwrapping a chocolate bar. The girl's eyes widened, not with joy but with something more primal. Recognition, memory of what food once meant. Her hand reached out, trembling violently, fingers barely able to maintain their grip. When Cooper placed the chocolate in her palm, she clutched it with surprising strength, as if it might evaporate if she loosened her hold. The mother's knees buckled. She sank to the cobblestones, one hand pressed against her mouth to stifle sobs that came anyway. Gratitude poured from her in waves of incomprehensible French, words tumbling over each other too rapidly for Cooper to distinguish individual syllables. She reached for his hand, kissing it repeatedly, tears streaming down her gaunt face. Other soldiers began distributing their rations. The scene repeated itself across the square, grown men and women weeping over crackers and canned meat. An elderly man fell to his knees upon receiving a tin of sardines, clutching it to his chest as if it contained gold. A teenage boy accepted a package of dried fruit and immediately turned to share it with younger siblings who appeared at his side. But there was no celebration, no cheering or dancing. The civilians accepted food with the solemn reverence of people receiving holy sacraments. Some ate immediately, cramming food into their mouths with shaking hands. Others carefully pocketed their portions, saving them for family members too weak to venture outside. A few simply held their rations and cried, overwhelmed by the sudden presence of something they had nearly forgotten existed. Cooper watched a small boy, perhaps 5 years old, stare at a piece of hard candy as if witnessing a miracle. The child turned it over in his fingers, examining it from every angle before finally, tentatively, placing it on his tongue. The expression that crossed his face, shock, confusion, then something approaching rapture, revealed that he barely remembered the taste of sugar. Lieutenant Morrison approached Cooper, his voice tight with suppressed emotion. "We need more supplies. These rations won't last 24 hours for this many people." Cooper nodded, unable to speak. He understood now why Command had warned them about conditions in liberated territories. But warnings could not prepare someone for this reality. Victory suddenly felt hollow. They had won battles, but these civilians had lost something far more fundamental than territory. The celebration they expected would not come today. Perhaps it would never come. Liberation meant survival, nothing more. By dawn the following day, military supply trucks rolled into the town square. Cooper and his unit had spent the night radiating urgent requests up the chain of command. The response came swiftly. Crates of K rations, medical supplies, powdered milk and emergency provisions descended upon the commune like manna from heaven. Organization proved challenging. The civilians, driven by months of deprivation, pressed forward with desperate urgency the moment trucks appeared. Cooper and his fellow soldiers struggled to maintain order, not through force, but through gentle guidance. They formed distribution lines, attempting to ensure everyone received a fair portion. The transformation began immediately, though subtly at first. Faces that had held no expression suddenly animated with cautious hope. Eyes that had stared vacantly now focused with sharp attention on the supplies being unloaded. Hands reached out, no longer trembling quite as violently. The mere presence of abundant food initiated psychological healing even before the first bite was taken. Cooper watched a father receive a box of rations and immediately distribute its contents among his 3 children. The man kept nothing for himself. His satisfaction derived entirely from watching his sons and daughter eat. The oldest child, a girl of perhaps 12, noticed her father's sacrifice and broke her biscuit in half, pressing the piece into his palm with quiet insistence. He accepted it with tears streaming down his weathered face. An elderly woman approached the distribution point supported by 2 younger women. When handed a package of dried soup mix, she clutched it to her chest and began praying aloud, her voice cracking with emotion. The younger women joined her prayer, all 3 standing in the middle of the square, thanking God and the Americans in equal measure. Lieutenant Morrison organized a makeshift field kitchen. Within hours, the smell of cooking food, real hot food, wafted through the streets. The aroma drew people from their homes like a physical force. Some emerged who had been too weak to venture out the previous day. They came slowly, supporting each other, refusing to miss this impossible moment. The soldiers found themselves profoundly affected by the operation. Men accustomed to combat now worked with tender care, helping elderly civilians carry their rations home, breaking chocolate bars into smaller pieces for children, learning basic French phrases to communicate compassion. Corporal Davies, known for his rough demeanor, spent an hour patiently feeding broth to a bedridden woman too weak to hold a spoon. Cooper noticed something shifting within himself and his comrades. The mission had changed. Yesterday they were conquerors. liberators in the traditional military sense. Today they were something different, providers of life itself. The weight of rifles on their shoulders seemed less significant than the weight of responsibility they now carried for these starving people. A young French boy, perhaps 8 years old, approached Cooper shyly. He held out a small, wilted flower, the only gift he possessed. Cooper accepted it with solemnity, tucking it carefully into his jacket pocket. The boy smiled for the first time, revealing gaps where teeth had fallen out from malnutrition. This, Cooper realized, was why they fought, not for territory or political ideology, but for moments like this, for the possibility of flowers offered by children who might actually survive to adulthood. Chapter 5. The humanitarian context. The famine ravaging France was no accident of war, no unfortunate byproduct of military conflict. It represented deliberate policy, carefully calculated and ruthlessly implemented. The Nazi occupation authorities had transformed starvation into a weapon. Wielding hunger with the same precision, they applied to bullets and bombs. German requisition programs operated with industrial efficiency. Occupation forces documented every farm, every field, every head of livestock. They established quotas that exceeded what French agriculture could sustainably produce while feeding its own population. Farmers who resisted faced imprisonment or execution. Those who complied watched helplessly as their harvests disappeared into German supply lines, leaving their own communities with nothing. The winter of 1944 had proven particularly catastrophic. Historical records documented temperatures plunging to brutal lows, while coal supplies, also requisitioned by German forces, vanished. Hospitals reported unprecedented numbers of hypothermia cases. Morgues overflowed with bodies of those who had simply frozen to death in their homes, too weak from hunger to generate sufficient body heat. Dr. Henri Blanchard, a physician in Lyon, wrote in his medical journal, "I no longer treat diseases in the traditional sense. I treat starvation and its endless complications. Children arrive with bodies so depleted that simple infections become death sentences. Their immune systems have collapsed. Measles kills. Common colds kill. I watch them die from ailments that should be trivial, and I am powerless because the cure is not medicine. It is food, and food does not exist." The situation grew so desperate that municipal authorities in some regions officially authorized the consumption of animals previously considered unfit for human diet. Horses, cats, dogs, even rats became acceptable protein sources. In Paris, the zoo animals disappeared, slaughtered to feed starving families. The botanical gardens were stripped of anything remotely edible. Women bore the psychological burden most acutely. Mothers watched their children waste away, unable to answer the most fundamental question, when will we eat? Some women stopped producing breast milk, their bodies too depleted to sustain lactation. Infants died at alarming rates, their tiny bodies incapable of surviving on the watered-down substitutes mothers desperately tried to provide. Thérèse Moreau, a mother of 4 from Bordeaux, recorded her anguish. "My youngest daughter asks me why God has abandoned us. She is 6 years old and weighs less than she did at age 3. Her hair falls out in clumps. Her teeth are loose. Yesterday she asked if we could eat the flowers in the garden. I told her flowers have no nutrition, but she insisted we try anyway. We boiled them into a tea. She drank it and said it tasted like hope. How do I tell her that hope cannot sustain life?" The psychological toll extended beyond immediate survival concerns. Communities fractured under the pressure. Neighbors who had lived peacefully for generations now eyed each other with suspicion, wondering who might steal from gardens or storage cellars. Trust eroded, social bonds dissolved. The fabric of French society, woven over centuries, unraveled thread by thread. By liberation, entire regions teetered on the edge of complete societal collapse. The Americans arrived not just to free territory, but to prevent the total disintegration of a civilization starved into near extinction. The children represented the cruelest victims of systematic starvation. Their small bodies, designed for growth and energy, instead consumed themselves to survive. Cooper witnessed conditions that defied his understanding of human resilience. Children so malnourished that their biological development had essentially halted, frozen in time by lack of nutrition. Medical officers accompanying the liberation forces documented cases with clinical horror. Children aged 10 who weighed less than 40 pounds. Toddlers unable to walk due to rickets' twisted legs. Infants with distended bellies and stick-thin limbs, classic symptoms of kwashiorkor, severe protein deficiency. The doctors worked frantically, but they faced an overwhelming tide of need that medical training had not prepared them to address. Captain Robert Hayes, a field surgeon, examined dozens of children in the first week. His reports painted a devastating picture. The children present with universal signs of advanced malnutrition, edema in the extremities, hair discoloration and brittleness, skin lesions from vitamin deficiencies. Many have stopped growing entirely. Their bodies have entered survival mode, shutting down non-essential functions. Some girls aged 12 or 13 show no signs of approaching puberty. Their bodies lack the resources to initiate development. These children are not sick in the conventional sense. They are dying slowly, and they have been dying for years. The distribution of food created scenes of heartbreaking desperation and cautious joy. When word spread that American rations included chocolate, children materialized from every corner of the town. They formed lines with remarkable discipline, having learned patience through years of scarcity, but their eyes betrayed their intensity, laser-focused on the packages being distributed, calculating the distance between themselves and salvation. A small girl named Sophie, whom Cooper encountered on his third day in the town, became emblematic of their plight. She could not have been older than 7, though malnutrition made precise age determination impossible. Her mother had died during the winter, frozen and starved. Her father had been taken by German forces months earlier. An elderly neighbor cared for Sophie, sharing her meager rations despite barely having enough for herself. When Cooper handed Sophie a chocolate bar, she did not immediately eat it. Instead, she broke it into careful pieces, wrapping most of them in a scrap of cloth. "Pour Madame Dubois," she explained in halting words. "For Madame Dubois, her elderly caretaker." Even in extremity, even at the edge of death, this child thought first of someone else. Cooper insisted she eat, using gestures and simple words. Sophie finally placed a small piece on her tongue, and her face transformed. Confusion flickered across her features first. The taste was foreign, belonging to a life she barely remembered. Then recognition dawned, followed by something approaching ecstasy. She closed her eyes, letting the chocolate melt slowly, savoring every molecule. Other soldiers reported similar encounters. Corporal Martinez described finding a group of children attempting to catch pigeons with makeshift traps, their hands too weak to hold the crude devices properly. Sergeant Thompson discovered siblings sharing a single moldy potato, dividing it with mathematical precision to ensure equality. Private Johnson witnessed a boy carefully collecting crumbs from distributed rations, sweeping them into his pocket to take home. The gratitude expressed by these children cut deeper than any words could convey. They brought small offerings, drawings made with charcoal, wildflowers picked from fields, smooth stones collected from streams, tokens of appreciation from those who possessed nothing material to give. What would become of these children? How many would survive the coming months? How many bore permanent damage from years of deprivation? These questions haunted Cooper as he watched them clutch their rations with desperate hope, their futures as uncertain as the next meal. The initial distribution of emergency rations represented only the beginning of a long, arduous journey toward recovery. As weeks passed, Cooper witnessed gradual transformations that medical science could barely explain. Children who had seemed beyond salvation slowly, impossibly began to heal. Color returned to pale cheeks. Eyes regained their spark. Bodies remembered how to grow. But physical recovery told only part of the story. The psychological wounds cut deeper than any nutritional deficiency. Children who had known nothing but hunger for years struggled to trust that food would continue arriving. Some hoarded portions, hiding them in secret places, unable to believe abundance would last. Others ate too quickly, making themselves sick, their bodies unable to process sudden nutrition after prolonged starvation. The town established a communal feeding program with American military support. 3 times daily, citizens gathered for meals prepared in field kitchens. The ritual became more than sustenance. It represented normalcy, community, hope. Families who had isolated themselves in survival mode gradually reconnected. Neighbors who had eyed each other with suspicion rediscovered trust. The social fabric, torn by desperation, began its slow, fragile repair. Sophie, the young girl who had shared her chocolate with her caretaker, thrived under consistent nutrition. Within 2 months, she had gained weight, her hair regained its luster, and most remarkably, she laughed. Cooper heard her giggling one afternoon while playing with other children, a sound so pure, so unburdened, it brought tears to his eyes. This was what they had fought for. This laughter, this possibility of childhood reclaimed. The soldiers themselves were transformed by the experience. Men who had defined themselves through combat now found deeper meaning in humanitarian work. They wrote letters home, describing not battles won, but children saved. Lieutenant Morrison confessed to Cooper one evening, "I killed German soldiers without hesitation, believing it was necessary, but I will remember feeding that starving boy far longer than any firefight. That moment mattered more than any tactical victory." Years later, when veterans returned to visit, they were greeted by adults who remembered them from childhood. Former skeletal children, now healthy parents themselves, embraced aging American soldiers with tears of gratitude. They introduced their own children, explaining how these men had saved their grandparents' generation. The gesture of compassion during war's darkest moment had created bonds transcending nationality and time. Cooper eventually returned home to Iowa, carrying memories that would shape the rest of his life. He spoke rarely of combat, but frequently of the French children. In 1967, he received a letter from Sophie, now a schoolteacher in Paris. She wrote, "You probably do not remember me. I was one of thousands of starving children you helped. But I remember you. I remember your kindness when kindness seemed extinct. I remember that you saw me as human when I felt like a ghost. I teach my students about the American soldiers who brought not just liberation, but life itself. You taught me that even in humanity's darkest hours, compassion survives." Cooper kept that letter in his Bible until his death in 1989. At his funeral, his children read it aloud, understanding finally what their father's service had truly meant.